Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the brutal winters of the Ice Age. Not the animated movie with the talking mammoth, but the actual 100,000-year nightmare that humanity somehow survived without central heating, grocery stores, or basic medical care. We're talking about people who lived in houses made of mammoth bones, wore the same fur clothes for months without washing them, and considered a meal of raw marrow and frozen fat to be a good day. But before we dive into this prehistoric horror show, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now grab your favorite drink, crank up that thermostat, and let's journey back to a time when being cold wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence that followed you everywhere you went. Picture the worst apartment you've ever seen. Now imagine it's made entirely of mammoth bones, sealed with animal dung, and you're trapped inside with your entire extended family for the next 6 months. No privacy, no ventilation, and absolutely no escape from the smell of unwashed humans who've been wearing the same fur clothes since autumn. Ice Age shelters weren't cozy little cabins with fireplaces and wooden furniture. They were desperate architectural experiments designed around one simple question: how do we not die tonight? And the answer, apparently, was to build structures that looked like something out of a serial killer's fever dream, but happened to be remarkably effective at keeping the wind from turning your family into human popsicles. The mammoth bone huts that archaeologists love to romanticize in documentaries were essentially igloos made of death. Picture this. You and your hunting party spend weeks tracking down a mammoth, which is basically a walking apartment building covered in fur and attitude. After you finally manage to kill this thing, which involved the kind of coordination and luck that would make modern special forces teams nervous, you don't just eat it and move on. You strip off every piece of usable material and turn the skeleton into your new house. The construction process was like IKEA furniture assembly, except the instructions were passed down through oral tradition. The pieces weighed hundreds of pounds each, and making a mistake meant your family would freeze to death during the next blizzard. The mammoth skulls became your foundation. The long bones formed the framework, and the ribs created the dome structure. It was functional architecture designed by people who understood that pretty wasn't an option when you were building with the leftover parts of something you'd just killed. But here's the part that modern people don't realize. These bone houses weren't just cleverly repurposed skeletons. They were sealed with whatever materials were available, which meant mud, animal dung, rotting vegetation, and anything else that could fill gaps and keep the wind out. Your walls were literally made of mammoth bones, held together with prehistoric cork made from decomposing organic matter. It was effective insulation, but living inside one was like spending the winter in a compost heap shaped like a house. The interior design was purely functional and absolutely claustrophobic. The entire living space was maybe 150 square feet for what could be 10 or 15 people, which meant everyone was constantly touching everyone else, breathing the same recycled air, and dealing with the accumulated smells of human bodies that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. Privacy wasn't just unavailable, it was a concept that didn't exist when survival required huddling together for warmth. Your floor was whatever you could find to create a barrier between human bodies and frozen ground. Animal hides, dried grass, pine needles, more bones. Anything that would provide some insulation from the earth that wanted to suck the heat out of your body through direct contact. But these floor coverings also absorbed every spill, every accident, every bodily fluid, and every scrap of food that got dropped, creating a permanent layer of organic matter that fermented throughout the winter months. The entrance was typically a low tunnel that you had to crawl through to get inside, which served two purposes. It kept warm air from escaping every time someone came or went, and it prevented large predators from just walking into your house and eating your family. But it also meant that getting in and out of your own home required crawling on your hands and knees through a tunnel that was probably damp, cold, and covered in whatever organic matter had accumulated since the last time someone bothered to clean it. Ventilation was a constant problem because you needed to keep warm air inside while also preventing everyone from suffocating on smoke from the fire, carbon dioxide from human respiration, and various gases produced by the decomposing materials that made up your walls and floor. The solution was usually a small hole at the top of the structure, but this created a delicate balance between getting enough fresh air and letting too much heat escape. The caves that some Ice Age humans lived in were slightly better in terms of structural integrity, but they came with their own delightful challenges. Natural caves provided protection from wind and some insulation from the cold, but they were also damp, dark, and frequently occupied by animals who had the same idea about using them for shelter. Moving into a cave meant evicting whatever bears, wolves, or other creatures had been using it, and then dealing with the lingering smells and potential diseases left behind by previous occupants. Cave living also meant dealing with water management issues that would make modern plumbers weep. Ice melting during brief warm periods, groundwater seepage, and condensation from human respiration created constant moisture problems. Your cave floor was perpetually damp, which meant everything you owned was also damp, and sleeping on wet surfaces in freezing temperatures was like trying to get comfortable on a block of ice while wearing wet clothes. The psychological impact of spending months in these shelters was probably as brutal as the physical challenges. Imagine being trapped in a small, dark, smelly space with the same people for 6 months straight, with no entertainment, no privacy, no escape, and the constant awareness that the walls made of bones and dung were the only thing standing between your family and death by freezing. The seasonal depression that some modern people experience during short winter days would seem like a minor mood fluctuation compared to the psychological stress of prehistoric winter survival. Maintenance of these shelters was an ongoing nightmare that required constant attention and increasingly desperate improvisation. Bones shifted and settled, creating gaps that let cold air in. The organic materials used for sealing deteriorated and needed replacement. Snow accumulation on the roof could cause structural problems. Wind damage from Ice Age storms could destroy weeks of construction work in a few hours. And here's the really disturbing part. These shelters were considered good housing by Ice Age standards. If you had a mammoth bone hut or a decent cave, you were living better than most humans at the time. Your Ice Age house wasn't a home. It was a survival bunker designed to keep you alive until the weather became less immediately lethal. You didn't live in it, you endured it, counting the days until you could crawl out of your bone prison and breathe air that didn't smell like decomposing mammoth parts and unwashed humans. But hey, at least the rent was free, assuming you didn't count the weeks of backbreaking labor required to build it, the constant maintenance needed to keep it functional, and the very real possibility that structural failure during a blizzard would kill everyone inside. By Ice Age standards, that was practically a luxury apartment. Now that you've crawled out of your bone house and confirmed that you're still technically alive, it's time to get dressed. And by get dressed, I mean wrapping yourself in multiple layers of animal fur, using a system so complex it would make NASA engineers nervous, because making a single mistake in your clothing choices meant spending the day slowly freezing to death from the inside out. Ice Age clothing wasn't about fashion, comfort, or personal expression. It was about creating a portable survival system that could keep your core body temperature above the point where your organs shut down, and you became a very disappointed corpse. Every layer had a specific function, every gap was a potential death sentence, and every piece of fur had been carefully selected, prepared, and maintained through processes that would make modern people immediately call PETA. The base layer was your underwear. except instead of cotton or synthetic materials, you wore the softest, finest fur you could get your hands on, usually rabbit, fox, or the inner fur of larger animals that had been scraped, cleaned, and prepared through methods that involved a lot of chewing. Yes, chewing. Ice Age women would literally chew animal hides to soften them, because saliva contained enzymes that made fur more pliable and comfortable against human skin. This base layer had to fit perfectly against your body, without gaps, wrinkles, or loose spots where cold air could sneak in. It was like wearing a custom-tailored fur bodysuit that had been designed by someone whose life depended on getting the measurements exactly right. Too loose, and cold air would circulate inside your clothes. Too tight, and you couldn't move properly, which could be fatal when you needed to run, hunt, or perform the countless physical tasks required for daily survival. The middle layers were where things got really complicated. You needed insulation that would trap warm air while still allowing enough flexibility to move, work, and hunt. This usually meant multiple layers of different fur types. Dense undercoat for insulation, longer outer fur for wind protection, and specialized pieces for areas like your joints where movement was critical, but heat loss was dangerous. Each layer had to be sewn together using sinew, animal tendons that had been extracted, cleaned, dried, and processed into thread through methods that were both time-consuming and absolutely revolting. The sewing process itself was done with needles made from bone, antler, or sharp stones, and every stitch had to be perfect because a loose seam could let in cold air that would gradually sap your body heat throughout the day. But here's where Ice Age clothing gets really nightmarish. You couldn't just throw on your fur outfit and head out for the day. Every morning, you had to inspect every piece of clothing for damage, wear, loose stitching, or gaps that might have developed overnight. You had to check the fur for ice buildup, moisture damage, or signs of deterioration that could compromise your insulation. You had to make sure every tie, every fastening, and every closure was secure and properly positioned. The outer layer was your shell, the final barrier between your body and an environment that wanted to kill you. This was typically made from the thickest, most wind-resistant hide available, often from large animals like mammoth, bison, or cave bear. But this outer layer wasn't just about protection. It was about managing moisture, because staying dry in Ice Age conditions was literally a matter of life and death. Human sweat, even in small amounts, could freeze inside your clothing and create ice crystals that would actually conduct cold deeper into your body. So your outer layer had to be designed to let moisture escape while preventing wind and snow from getting in. This meant carefully positioned ventilation areas, specialized closures, and a constant awareness of how much you were sweating during physical activity. The extremities were where most people lost the battle against frostbite, so hand and foot coverings weren't just clothing. They were precision, life support equipment. Your mittens weren't cute winter accessories. They were survival tools made from multiple layers of fur, designed with removable finger covers so you could perform detailed tasks without exposing your hands to air that could freeze your fingers solid in minutes. Your feet required even more complex protection because they had to support your body weight while providing insulation, traction, and protection from sharp objects hidden under snow. Ice Age boots were basically custom-engineered survival systems that combined multiple types of hide, fur insulation, and whatever materials were available for creating traction on ice and snow. But the absolute worst part of Ice Age clothing was maintenance. These weren't garments you could just throw in a washing machine or take to a dry cleaner. Every piece had to be constantly cleaned, repaired, and maintained through processes that were labor-intensive, time-consuming, and often dangerous. Fur had to be scraped clean of ice, blood, and accumulated grime. Hides had to be re-oiled to maintain flexibility. Seams had to be reinforced before they failed completely. And you couldn't just take off your clothes when they needed maintenance, because taking off your insulation in Ice Age conditions meant rapid heat loss that could kill you before you could get dressed again. So maintenance had to be done while wearing the clothes, or you had to have backup clothing available, which doubled the amount of fur processing and garment construction your group needed to survive. The psychological pressure of getting dressed every morning was enormous, because you knew that every choice you made about layering, every decision about which furs to wear, and every assessment of your clothing's condition could determine whether you lived through the day. It wasn't getting dressed. It was suiting up for daily battle against an environment that was actively trying to kill you. Your clothing became a second skin that you lived in for months at a time, because changing clothes in Ice Age conditions was dangerous, time-consuming, and often impossible. You wore the same fur layers day and night, week after week, month after month, until they became so integrated with your daily existence that they stopped feeling like clothing and started feeling like part of your body. And here's the really disturbing part. Even perfect clothing wasn't a guarantee of survival. The best designed, most carefully maintained Ice Age outfit could still fail if you made a single mistake, encountered unexpected weather, or found yourself in a situation where your clothing system couldn't protect you from the brutal reality of trying to stay alive in a world that was frozen solid. Getting dressed in the Ice Age wasn't a morning routine. It was a daily life or death engineering challenge that required expertise, constant attention, and the kind of precision that most modern people reserve for activities like surgery or space exploration. One gap in your fur layers, and the cold would crawl in and slowly kill you from the inside out. Now we need to talk about fire, and I want you to forget everything you think you know about building campfires or lighting your gas stove. In the Ice Age, fire wasn't a convenience or a nice ambience for roasting marshmallows. Fire was the thin line between your family waking up tomorrow and your family becoming human-shaped ice sculptures that wouldn't thaw until spring. Ice Age fire maintenance was a 24-hour job that required the same level of constant attention that modern people give to keeping a premature baby alive in an incubator. Except instead of monitoring medical equipment, you were monitoring a collection of glowing coals that represented the difference between life and death for everyone you cared about. Let that fire die, and you weren't just cold, you were probably dead. The first thing you need to understand is that Ice Age humans didn't have matches, lighters, or convenient ways to restart fires once they went out. Creating fire from scratch using flint, steel, and tinder was a process that could take anywhere from several minutes to several hours, depending on conditions. And those conditions were usually terrible, because you were doing this with numb fingers, in wind, possibly in snow, while your family slowly froze to death, waiting for you to get it right. So the entire survival strategy revolved around never letting your fire go completely out in the first place. This meant maintaining what archaeologists call ember preservation, keeping a core of hot coals alive continuously for months at a time. Think of it as running a wood-burning engine that couldn't be allowed to stop, staffed by people who had never taken an engineering course and whose fuel supply was whatever they could find, dig up or steal from other desperate families. The ember preservation process required someone to tend the fire constantly, which meant your family had to organize sleep schedules around fire duty. Someone always had to be awake, monitoring the coals, adding fuel, adjusting airflow, and making sure the fire didn't burn too hot and waste fuel, or too cool and risk going out entirely. It was like having a night security job where falling asleep on duty meant everyone died. But here's where Ice Age fire maintenance gets really brutal. Fuel wasn't just scarce, it was often completely unavailable. You couldn't just walk outside and gather firewood like you were camping in a modern forest. Ice Age winters meant months of conditions where trees were buried under snow, wood was frozen solid and impossible to burn effectively, and most organic matter was either too wet, too frozen, or too decomposed to be useful as fuel. So what did Ice Age humans burn to stay alive? Anything that would produce heat for longer than it took to find and prepare. Animal dung was a primary fuel source, which meant collecting, drying, and storing excrement from whatever animals were available. Mammoth dung, bison dung, horse dung. If it came out of an animal and would burn, it was precious fuel that could mean the difference between surviving the night and freezing to death before dawn. Bone was another critical fuel source, but burning bones effectively required techniques that modern people would find absolutely horrifying. You couldn't just throw bones on a fire and expect them to burn. They had to be processed, often by smashing them open to access the marrow, then feeding the fire with both the bone fragments and the fatty marrow that would burn hot enough to keep the fire going for extended periods. Fat became liquid fire when it was available, but getting fat meant successfully hunting animals in conditions where hunting was nearly impossible, then processing the carcass quickly enough that the fat didn't freeze into unusable chunks before you could extract it. When you had animal fat available, you could create fires that burned hotter and longer than anything else. But fat was so valuable for food that burning it for heat meant choosing between staying warm tonight and having enough calories to survive tomorrow. The tinder situation was even more desperate because you needed dry, easily combustible material to restart fires when they inevitably burned too low. This meant collecting and storing fungus, dried grass, bark, and any other organic matter that would catch fire quickly. But all of this had to be kept absolutely dry, which was nearly impossible in Ice Age conditions where everything was either frozen, wet, or covered in snow. Fungus was the gold standard for Ice Age tinder because certain types would smolder for hours without flames, allowing you to transport fire from one location to another, or restart a fire from dying coals. But finding, harvesting, and preparing fungus required expertise that took years to develop, and making mistakes could mean losing your ability to restart fires when you desperately needed them. The fire itself had to be managed with the precision of a nuclear reactor, because too much heat would waste precious fuel, while too little heat would let the fire die and potentially kill everyone. You had to understand airflow, fuel density, coal management, and a dozen other variables that determined whether your fire would burn efficiently through the night or consume all your fuel in a few hours and leave you with nothing. Smoke management was another nightmare because you needed the heat from the fire but couldn't afford to suffocate everyone in your shelter with toxic fumes. This meant carefully positioning fires, creating ventilation systems with whatever materials were available, and constantly monitoring air quality in enclosed spaces where carbon monoxide poisoning could kill your family even if the coal didn't. The psychological pressure of fire maintenance was enormous because everyone understood that fire duty was literally life or death responsibility. The person tending the fire wasn't just doing a chore. They were keeping everyone alive through their constant attention and expertise. Fall asleep during your fire watch, and you wake up to discover your family has frozen to death while you were unconscious. Fire tools were precious survival equipment that had to be constantly maintained and protected. Your flint had to be kept dry and sharp. Your steel or iron pyrite had to be preserved from rust and damage. Your tinder collection had to be organized and accessible even in the worst conditions. Losing or breaking your fire-making tools was like losing your life insurance policy in a world where accidents were usually fatal. The fuel-gathering process was back-breaking work that required enormous amounts of time and energy during the brief periods when weather conditions allowed you to venture outside. You had to identify potential fuel sources, often buried under snow or ice, then extract, transport, and prepare materials for burning. And you had to do this constantly, because fuel consumption during Ice Age winters was massive, and running out meant immediate death. Here's the really terrifying part. Even perfect fire management skills and adequate fuel supplies weren't guarantees of survival. Weather could change suddenly, and make fire maintenance impossible. Accidents could destroy your fuel supply. Illness could prevent someone from performing fire duty when they were desperately needed. Ice Age fire wasn't a cozy campfire experience. It was a constant battle against an environment that wanted to extinguish the only thing keeping your family alive. Every piece of dung you burned, every bone you smashed for marrow, every fungus you carefully dried for tinder was part of an ongoing life support system that required expertise, constant attention, and the kind of dedication that modern people reserve for the most critical aspects of their lives. Your fire wasn't just heat and light. It was the beating heart of your survival system, and keeping it alive required the same level of vigilance that a surgeon brings to keeping a patient alive on an operating table. Except the patient was your entire family. The operation lasted for months, and making a single mistake meant everyone died. Now we need to address something that historical documentaries conveniently skip over, but was actually one of the most dangerous and psychologically brutal aspects of Ice Age survival. How do you go to the bathroom when the outside temperature can literally freeze exposed skin in minutes, and privacy is a luxury that can get you killed? Ice Age toileting wasn't just inconvenient or unpleasant. It was a life-threatening activity that required planning, timing, and the kind of courage that most modern people reserve for extreme sports. Every time you needed to relieve yourself, you were essentially planning a military operation where making a mistake could result in frostbite, exposure, or death by freezing while your pants were around your ankles. The basic logistics were absolutely nightmarish. You couldn't just duck behind a tree or find a private spot like modern camping, because outside meant stepping into an environment that was actively trying to kill you. The air temperature was often 40 degrees below zero, or worse. The wind could strip heat from exposed skins so quickly that frostbite could begin in seconds, and snow wasn't just cold, it was often deep enough to make movement difficult and hide dangerous obstacles that could injure you when you were most vulnerable. So the process started with timing, which meant trying to coordinate your bodily functions with weather conditions, group activities, and safety considerations that were constantly changing. You couldn't just go when you felt the urge. You had to wait for moments when conditions were survivable, when other people were available for safety support, and when you could afford to lose body heat without compromising your survival for the rest of the day. The preparation process was like suiting up for a spacewalk, except instead of sophisticated life support equipment, you had layers of fur clothing that had to be carefully arranged for quick removal and replacement. You had to plan exactly how you would remove necessary clothing, how you would protect exposed skin from wind and snow, and how you would get dressed again as quickly as possible before hypothermia set in. But here's where Ice Age toileting gets really brutal. You couldn't do this alone. Going outside by yourself for any reason was essentially suicide, so bathroom breaks required at least one other person to serve as a lookout for predators, weather changes, or emergencies. This meant that your most private bodily functions became group activities that involved detailed planning and coordination with people who were also struggling to survive. The actual process was a race against time and temperature that would make modern people weep with sympathy for their ancestors. You had to find a spot that was relatively protected from wind, accessible despite snow depth, and safe from predators, all while your exposed skin was losing heat so rapidly that you could feel your body temperature dropping in real time. Toilet paper didn't exist, so you used whatever soft materials were available: moss, animal fur, soft leaves if they could be found, or sometimes nothing at all except snow, which was like wiping yourself with frozen sandpaper while your body heat melted the snow into ice water that immediately refroze on your skin. The cleaning process had to be completed as quickly as possible, because extended exposure meant frostbite in areas where frostbite would create serious long-term health problems. The clothing situation was absolutely critical, because you had to expose skin while maintaining as much insulation as possible around the rest of your body. This meant developing techniques for partially undressing in sub-zero conditions without losing the heat that was keeping you alive. Your clothing layers had to be arranged so they could be quickly moved aside and then immediately restored to their protective positions. And you had to do all of this while squatting or positioning yourself in ways that protected you from direct contact with snow and ice, because sitting directly on frozen ground would instantly drain body heat from your core and could cause hypothermia even during brief exposure. Finding positions that were functional, safe, and provided adequate protection from the elements required flexibility and planning that turned basic bodily functions into athletic events. The psychological aspect was perhaps the worst part, because you were dealing with the stress of extreme vulnerability while your body was experiencing rapid heat loss, and your mind was focused on completing the process as quickly as possible. There was no relaxation, no privacy, no comfort, just desperate efficiency driven by the knowledge that every second of exposure increased your risk of serious injury or death. Nighttime bathroom needs were even worse because they meant leaving the warmth of your shelter during the coldest part of the day, often in complete darkness, when predators were most active and weather conditions were most dangerous. Many people probably chose to hold it rather than risk nighttime exposure, which created its own health problems and added to the general misery of Ice Age survival. Group bathroom breaks were necessary for safety, but created social dynamics that modern people would find absolutely unbearable. Your most private moments became shared experiences that everyone had to participate in and support, because individual privacy was a luxury that could get people killed when survival required constant group cooperation and mutual protection. The waste management afterward was another challenge, because human waste in Ice Age conditions didn't just disappear or decompose naturally. It froze, accumulated, and created sanitation problems around living areas that could attract predators or cause disease. Managing human waste disposal became another survival task that required time, energy, and attention that people needed for other life-threatening priorities. Digestive problems, which were probably common due to irregular food supplies, stress, and the general health challenges of Ice Age survival, turned bathroom needs into medical emergencies that required immediate attention regardless of weather conditions or safety concerns. Diarrhea or stomach illness in Ice Age conditions meant repeated exposure to life-threatening cold during a time when your body was already compromised and least able to handle additional stress. The tool situation was also problematic because personal hygiene items had to be made, maintained, and carried as part of your survival equipment. Cleaning tools, protective materials, and anything else needed for sanitation had to be crafted from available materials and carefully preserved, because losing or damaging these items meant facing future bathroom emergencies without adequate supplies. Women faced additional challenges during menstruation, when biological processes that are manageable with modern supplies became survival challenges that required specialized materials, planning, and support from the group. Managing feminine hygiene in sub-zero conditions with improvised materials while maintaining the clothing systems necessary for survival would have been absolutely brutal. Here's the really disturbing part. Even perfect planning and execution of Ice Age bathroom breaks still carried significant risks. Weather could change suddenly during the process. Equipment could fail. Accidents could happen when people were most vulnerable. And the cumulative effect of repeated exposure during bathroom breaks contributed to the overall heat loss and physical stress that made Ice Age survival so difficult. Ice Age toileting wasn't just uncomfortable or inconvenient. It was a dangerous survival challenge that required courage, planning, and group cooperation every single time nature called. You didn't just go to the bathroom. You mounted expeditions into life-threatening conditions while hoping you'd make it back to your shelter before the cold could kill you. Every bathroom break was a reminder of how vulnerable humans are, and how many basic activities that modern people take for granted become potentially lethal when you're trying to survive in an environment that's actively hostile to human life. Now let's talk about the most important meal of the day in the Ice Age, which wasn't about balanced nutrition, favorite flavors, or Instagram-worthy presentations. Ice Age breakfast was about consuming enough calories to fuel your body through another day of survival activities, while hoping that whatever you were eating wouldn't make you sick enough to become a liability to the group that was keeping you alive. Your Ice Age breakfast menu wasn't determined by personal preferences or dietary restrictions. It was determined by what was available, what had survived the night without spoiling, and what your body desperately needed to maintain core temperature and basic function in an environment that was constantly trying to kill you. If it had calories and wasn't actively poisonous, it qualified as breakfast food. Marrow was the gold standard of Ice Age breakfast because it was pure fat and protein that could provide massive amounts of energy in a concentrated form. But getting marrow meant someone had successfully hunted an animal, transported it back to your shelter, and processed the carcass quickly enough that the bones could be cracked open before everything froze solid. This involved smashing bones with stone tools to access the fatty interior that would keep your body burning calories at the rate necessary for cold weather survival. The marrow extraction process was brutal and time-consuming work that required tools, technique, and strength that had to be maintained even when people were exhausted, cold, and dealing with the physical stress of Ice Age living. You had to crack bones without destroying the marrow inside, extract the fat without losing precious calories to spillage, and process everything quickly before it became too cold to consume effectively. Broth was another breakfast staple, because it provided warm calories that could help raise your core body temperature while delivering nutrition from whatever animal parts were available for cooking. But making broth in Ice Age conditions meant using precious fuel to heat water, managing cooking fires in enclosed spaces without suffocating everyone with smoke, and finding containers that could hold liquid without leaking or breaking. The broth-making process used everything from animal bones to organ meat, fat scraps, and whatever plant materials might be available and edible. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant losing calories that could determine whether someone lived or died during the next hunting expedition or fuel-gathering mission. Even the cooking process had to be managed carefully, because overheating would waste fuel, while underheating meant consuming food that might carry diseases or parasites. Dried meat was breakfast fast food for Ice Age humans. Portable protein that had been processed during better times and stored for moments when fresh food wasn't available. But dried meat in Ice Age conditions was often frozen solid, which meant it had to be thawed near fires, chewed extensively to make it digestible, and consumed in small amounts because it was concentrated nutrition that had to last as long as possible. The meat drying process required expertise that took years to develop and perfect weather conditions that weren't always available when you needed them. Meat had to be cut into specific thicknesses, dried at the right temperature and humidity levels, and stored in ways that prevented spoilage while keeping it accessible for daily consumption. Making mistakes in the drying process meant losing precious protein that could have sustained the group through periods when hunting was impossible. Frozen fat was pure survival fuel that provided more calories per bite than almost anything else available. But consuming frozen fat was like eating cold butter mixed with ice crystals. It had to be chewed extensively, warmed in your mouth until it became liquid enough to swallow, and consumed in amounts that provided energy without causing digestive problems that could incapacitate you when you needed all your strength for survival activities. The psychological aspect of eating frozen fat was probably almost as challenging as the physical process, because it required overcoming natural revulsion to consume something that looked, tasted, and felt like eating chunks of cold lard. But people who couldn't force themselves to eat high-calorie foods didn't maintain the energy levels necessary for Ice Age survival, and often didn't live long enough to become picky about their dietary preferences. Organ meat was another breakfast option that provided essential nutrients but required immediate consumption after animals were killed because organs spoiled quickly even in cold conditions. Liver, kidneys, heart, and other organs had to be eaten fresh, often while they were still warm from the animal's body heat, because waiting meant losing nutrition that could be critical for maintaining health during extended periods of survival stress. The fresh organ consumption process was probably revolting by modern standards, but provided vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that weren't available from muscle meat alone. People who refused to eat organ meat often developed deficiency diseases that compromised their ability to contribute to group survival and made them more vulnerable to the infections and injuries that were common during Ice Age living. Plant foods were rarely available during Ice Age winters, but when nuts, roots, or other plant materials could be found, they provided carbohydrates and vitamins that balanced the heavy protein and fat diet that was typical of Ice Age nutrition. Finding plant foods required knowledge of what was edible, where to look for buried or preserved plant materials, and how to process them to make them safe for consumption. The plant food preparation process often involved techniques like grinding nuts with stone tools, processing roots to remove toxins or make them digestible, and combining plant materials with animal products to create meals that provided more complete nutrition than either food type could deliver alone. But plant foods were so rare during winter months that most Ice Age breakfast meals were almost entirely animal-based. Breakfast timing was determined by fuel availability, weather conditions, and the day's planned activities, rather than by hunger or personal preference. Cooking required precious fuel that couldn't be wasted, so meals were often combined or timed to maximize the use of fires that were being maintained for warmth. If conditions didn't allow for cooking, breakfast might be entirely cold food that had been prepared during better weather. The eating process itself was communal and carefully managed, because food sharing was essential for group survival, and individual portions had to be calculated based on each person's contribution to group activities, their current health status, and the overall food supplies available. No one ate alone, no one ate as much as they wanted, and everyone understood that their breakfast portions depended on the success of group hunting and gathering efforts. Here's the really sobering part about Ice Age breakfast. Even a successful morning meal that provided adequate calories and nutrition was no guarantee that food would be available later in the day, or that hunting and gathering activities would produce enough resources to sustain the group through another 24-hour cycle. Every breakfast could potentially be the last substantial meal people ate for several days. Ice Age breakfast wasn't about starting your day right or fueling up for productivity. It was about consuming enough calories to maintain basic body function, while hoping that the day's survival activities would produce enough resources to justify the energy expenditure required to stay alive in an environment that was actively hostile to human existence. You didn't enjoy breakfast. You consumed whatever was available, grateful that you had anything at all to eat, while knowing that tomorrow's breakfast depended on decisions and actions that could get you killed before you ever had the chance to be hungry again. Now we need to talk about personal hygiene during the Ice Age, and I want you to prepare yourself for a reality that would make modern people immediately book therapy sessions. Ice Age hygiene wasn't about feeling fresh, looking good, or maintaining social standards. It was about preventing infections and diseases that could kill you while managing the accumulated filth of living in close quarters with other unwashed humans for months at a time. Let's start with the fundamental problem. You haven't had a proper bath in weeks, possibly months. Your body is covered in layers of accumulated sweat, dead skin, animal blood, food residue, and whatever other organic matter you've encountered during daily survival activities. Your hair is matted with grease, debris, and probably home to various parasites that have set up permanent residence in your scalp. Your fingernails contain so much dirt and organic matter that they've become miniature archaeology sites documenting everything you've touched in recent memory. But here's the thing that makes Ice Age hygiene so psychologically brutal. You can't just take a shower and fix these problems. Water was often frozen solid. Heating water required precious fuel that you needed for survival, and exposing your body to clean yourself meant losing body heat that could literally kill you before you finished washing. So you lived with levels of filth that would make modern people immediately call health services. The smell situation was probably beyond what modern people can imagine. You're wearing the same fur clothing for months without washing it, living in enclosed spaces with multiple other people who are equally dirty, and dealing with the accumulated odors of cooking, waste management, and general human existence in conditions where nothing gets properly cleaned. The smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was a constant reminder of how far human existence had been reduced to basic survival. Snow became your primary cleaning tool, which meant scrubbing your body with frozen water crystals that would immediately melt and then refreeze on your skin. The snowbathing process was like taking a shower with ice water while standing outside in sub-zero temperatures, knowing that you had to complete the entire process quickly before hypothermia set in and killed you. The snow scrubbing technique required removing clothing in stages, quickly cleaning exposed body parts with handfuls of snow, and then immediately covering yourself again before moving to the next area. It was less like bathing and more like performing emergency decontamination procedures, while your body temperature dropped dangerously with each minute of exposure. But even snowbathing was a luxury that was only possible when weather conditions allowed for brief exposure, when you had access to clean snow that wasn't contaminated with waste or debris, and when you could afford to lose the body heat that the cleaning process required. Most of the time, you just lived with whatever level of filth had accumulated since your last opportunity to clean yourself. Lice were probably universal companions for Ice Age humans, because the conditions that supported human survival also created perfect environments for parasites. Your warm, unwashed body, covered in fur clothing, provided ideal habitat for lice, fleas, and other parasites that would multiply rapidly in conditions where you couldn't properly clean yourself or your belongings. The lice situation wasn't just annoying. It was a constant health threat because parasites could carry diseases, cause infections, and create open wounds that could become seriously infected in conditions where medical care consisted of hoping problems would heal on their own. Managing lice required constant picking, which was time-consuming, disgusting, and often futile, because the parasites would quickly re-establish themselves in conditions that you couldn't change. Hair maintenance was another nightmare, because your hair became matted, greasy, and filled with debris that was impossible to remove without proper washing. Hair that modern people would consider completely unacceptable was the normal state for Ice Age humans, who had to choose between spending time and energy on hair care or focusing on survival activities that kept them alive. The hair situation was made worse by the fact that your hair was often covered by fur hoods or other head coverings that trapped moisture, debris, and parasites, while preventing air circulation that might have helped maintain basic cleanliness. Your hair wasn't just dirty. It was compressed under layers of fur that created perfect conditions for bacterial growth and parasite infestations. Dental hygiene was virtually non-existent because toothbrushes, toothpaste, and dental floss hadn't been invented yet. Ice Age humans cleaned their teeth by chewing on fibrous materials, using sharp objects to remove food debris, and hoping that their diet of raw meat and fat wouldn't cause tooth decay or gum disease that could lead to serious infections. The dental situation was probably horrifying by modern standards, with tooth decay, gum disease, and dental infections being common problems that could cause serious pain and health complications. Losing teeth meant reduced ability to process food, which could lead to malnutrition and increased vulnerability to the diseases and injuries that were constant threats during Ice Age survival. Skin care consisted of trying to prevent frostbite, treating cuts and scrapes with whatever materials were available, and hoping that minor injuries wouldn't become infected and develop into serious health problems. Your skin was constantly exposed to harsh conditions, rough materials, and environmental hazards that would cause damage that you couldn't properly treat or prevent. The skin problems were made worse by the fact that you were wearing the same unwashed fur clothing against your skin for extended periods, which created ideal conditions for rashes, infections, and other skin problems that could become serious health issues when you didn't have access to proper medical care or cleaning supplies. Menstrual hygiene for women was managed with whatever absorbent materials were available: moss, fur, cloth scraps, or other organic matter that could be used to manage menstrual flow. These materials had to be found, prepared, and maintained without access to modern sanitary products, and the used materials had to be disposed of in ways that didn't create health hazards for the group. The menstrual management process was probably incredibly difficult and uncomfortable, requiring women to deal with normal biological processes while maintaining the clothing systems necessary for survival, participating in group activities that were essential for everyone's survival, and managing hygiene needs with improvised materials that were often inadequate for the purpose. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age hygiene so disturbing. You knew you were filthy, you knew you smelled terrible, and you knew that your lack of cleanliness was creating health risks that could kill you. But you also knew that the time, energy, and resources required for proper hygiene were resources that you needed for survival activities that were more immediately life-threatening. So you lived with levels of filth and discomfort that would be considered unbearable by modern standards, constantly aware that your lack of cleanliness was making you vulnerable to diseases and infections, but unable to do anything about it because staying clean was less important than staying alive. Ice Age hygiene wasn't about personal comfort or social acceptability. It was about managing the health consequences of living in conditions where basic cleanliness was a luxury that could get you killed if you spent too much time and energy pursuing it. You weren't clean, you weren't comfortable, and you weren't healthy by modern standards, but you were alive, and that was the only standard that mattered. Now let's talk about your feet, because in the Ice Age, your feet weren't just the things that carried you around. They were precision, life support equipment that required constant maintenance, daily inspection, and the kind of obsessive care that most modern people reserve for expensive cars or newborn babies. Lose your feet to frostbite, and you didn't just become disabled. You became a burden that your group couldn't afford to carry, which usually meant a slow, painful death from exposure or starvation. Ice Age footwear wasn't about style, comfort, or making a fashion statement. It was about creating a portable survival system that could keep your feet functional in conditions that would destroy unprotected flesh in minutes. Your boots were essentially custom-engineered life support pods that had to provide insulation, waterproofing, traction, and protection from sharp objects, all while allowing enough mobility to hunt, gather, and perform the countless physical tasks required for daily survival. The construction process for Ice Age boots was like building miniature survival shelters for your feet, using materials and techniques that required expertise, developed over years of trial and error. The outer shell was typically made from the toughest available hide, usually from large animals like mammoth, bison, or elk, that had been processed through methods involving scraping, treating, and softening that would make modern leather workers weep with exhaustion. But the outer shell was just the beginning, because Ice Age boots required multiple layers of insulation that had to be carefully selected, prepared, and maintained to keep your feet warm in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in seconds. The inner layers were typically made from softer furs, often from smaller animals like rabbit or fox, that provided dense insulation while remaining flexible enough to allow normal foot movement. The insulation system included materials that modern people would find absolutely revolting, but were essential for Ice Age survival. Moss was a critical component because it provided excellent insulation while also absorbing moisture that could freeze inside your boots and cause frostbite. But the moss had to be harvested, dried, and processed to remove debris and parasites before it could be used safely. Animal fur was layered inside boots to create air pockets that trapped warm air while wicking moisture away from your feet. But this fur had to be selected from specific animals, processed to remove oils and debris, and arranged in ways that provided maximum insulation without creating bulk that would make your boots too tight or inflexible for normal use. The waterproofing process involved treating leather with animal fats, oils, and other substances that would prevent water from penetrating the outer shell, while still allowing moisture from your feet to escape. This required a delicate balance because completely waterproof boots would trap moisture inside, creating conditions that could cause trench foot or other serious problems that would make you unable to walk. But here's where Ice Age footwear gets really complicated. You couldn't just build a pair of boots and expect them to last for months. The extreme conditions meant that your boots required constant maintenance, daily inspection, and regular replacement of components that wore out, got damaged, or became ineffective due to accumulated wear and environmental stress. The daily boot maintenance routine was like performing surgery on your life support equipment, because every small problem could escalate into a major threat to your survival. You had to check for holes, worn areas, loose stitching, and signs of deterioration that could compromise the insulation or waterproofing that kept your feet functional. The stitching required constant attention because the sinew thread used to hold boots together would stretch, break, or deteriorate under the stress of daily use in extreme conditions. Every loose seam was a potential entry point for cold air, moisture, or debris that could cause frostbite or other foot problems that would make you unable to walk. The sole situation was particularly critical because your boot soles had to provide traction on ice and snow while protecting your feet from sharp objects, rough terrain, and the constant cold that would drain heat from your body through ground contact. This meant creating multi-layered sole systems that combined toughness, insulation, and grip, using materials that were often difficult to find and process. Traction was achieved through various methods that required ingenuity and constant maintenance. Sharp pieces of bone, stone, or metal might be embedded in boot soles to provide grip on ice, but these additions had to be carefully secured to prevent them from working loose and creating holes that would compromise the boot's protective function. The fitting process was absolutely critical because boots that were too tight would restrict circulation and cause frostbite, while boots that were too loose would allow cold air to circulate inside and create conditions that could freeze your feet, even with adequate insulation. Getting the fit right required expertise that took years to develop and constant adjustments as conditions changed. Daily frostbite prevention required a routine that would make modern people immediately appreciate heated cars and insulated buildings. Every morning, you had to inspect your feet for signs of frostbite damage, check your boots for problems that might compromise their protective function, and make sure your insulation materials were dry and properly arranged. The toe check was a daily ritual that could determine whether you lived or died during the coming day. You had to examine each toe for signs of frostbite, including changes in color, texture, or sensation that indicated tissue damage. Catching frostbite early meant you might be able to treat it before permanent damage occurred, but missing the early signs could mean losing toes or entire feet. The toe check process required removing boots and insulation layers, which meant losing precious body heat while exposing your feet to cold air that could cause additional frostbite damage. So the inspection had to be completed quickly and efficiently, with immediate rewarming procedures if any problems were discovered. Frostbite treatment consisted of gradual rewarming using whatever heat sources were available, but the treatment process was extremely painful. and often resulted in permanent damage even when performed correctly. Severe frostbite meant tissue death that could lead to infections, gangrene, and the need for amputation using stone tools and no anesthesia, other than hoping you'd pass out from the pain. The sock situation was managed using whatever soft materials were available to create layers between your feet and your boots. These improvised socks had to be changed regularly because moisture buildup could cause foot problems that would make you unable to walk. But changing socks meant having backup materials available and spending time on foot care that you needed for other survival activities. Foot warming techniques required constant attention throughout the day because your feet were particularly vulnerable to cold injury due to their distance from your core body heat and their exposure to ground cold through boot soles. This meant regular foot exercises, warming procedures, and vigilance about foot comfort that had to be maintained even during other survival activities. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age footwear so terrifying. You knew that every step you took could be the one that caused boot failure, foot injury, or frostbite damage that would make you unable to walk. Your feet weren't just body parts. They were the foundation of your entire survival system, and losing them meant losing your ability to hunt, gather, and perform the physical activities that kept you alive. The boot replacement process required planning, materials, and skills that had to be maintained constantly, because worn-out boots couldn't be quickly replaced when you needed them. You had to anticipate boot failure, prepare replacement materials, and have the expertise to construct new boots quickly when your old ones became unusable. Ice Age footwear wasn't about comfortable walking or foot fashion. It was about maintaining the mobility that was essential for survival while protecting your feet from an environment that would destroy them, given the slightest opportunity. Every boot was a custom survival tool that required constant care, and every step was a reminder that your feet were the only thing standing between you and death, by exposure in a world that was actively trying to freeze you solid. Now we need to talk about the daily grind of Ice Age survival, and I want you to forget everything you think you know about household chores or weekend yard work. Ice Age chores weren't about maintaining a comfortable living environment or keeping up with social standards. They were about performing life or death tasks that required enormous amounts of time, energy, and physical effort just to maintain the basic conditions necessary for surviving another 24-hour cycle. Every Ice Age chore was essentially a race against time and environmental conditions that were actively trying to kill you. You weren't cleaning your house or organizing your belongings. You were performing maintenance on survival systems that would fail catastrophically if you didn't give them constant attention. And the consequences of falling behind on your chores weren't just inconvenience or embarrassment, they were usually death. Fuel gathering was the most time-consuming and physically demanding chore, because maintaining fire required enormous amounts of combustible material that had to be found, collected, processed, and transported under conditions that made every aspect of the job brutally difficult. You weren't just gathering firewood like a weekend camping trip. You were collecting enough fuel to keep a fire burning continuously for months, while competing with other desperate families for the same limited resources. The fuel gathering process started with identifying potential fuel sources in an environment where most organic matter was either buried under snow, frozen solid, or already claimed by other groups who were equally desperate to keep their fires burning. You had to develop expertise in recognizing what would burn effectively, what could be processed into usable fuel, and what was worth the enormous effort required to collect and transport it back to your shelter. Wood was the premium fuel source when it was available, but Ice Age winters meant that most wood was either buried under snow that was too deep to dig through, frozen so solid that it wouldn't burn effectively, or located in areas that were too dangerous to access due to weather conditions or predator activity. Finding usable wood required extensive searching, often in conditions where exposure could kill you before you found anything worth collecting. The wood processing job was backbreaking work that required tools, strength, and techniques that had to be maintained even when you were exhausted, cold, and dealing with the physical stress of Ice Age survival. Wood had to be broken down into sizes that would burn efficiently, dried enough to ignite properly, and transported back to your shelter without losing precious pieces to wind, snow, or accidents during the journey. Dung collection was a fuel-gathering activity that modern people would find absolutely revolting, but was essential for Ice Age survival, because animal excrement was often the most available and reliable fuel source during winter months. You had to locate animal dung, assess its quality for burning, and collect it in quantities that would provide meaningful fuel while competing with other groups who had the same idea. The dung processing procedure involved breaking apart frozen excrement, removing debris and non-combustible materials, and preparing it for burning in ways that would provide maximum heat output while minimizing smoke and toxic fumes that could suffocate everyone in your shelter. This required expertise in evaluating different types of dung, understanding how they burned, and managing the storage and preparation process. Bone fuel required even more specialized knowledge, because burning bones effectively meant processing them in ways that would release the fats and oils that provided heat, while managing the ash and residue that could clog your fire or create dangerous conditions in enclosed spaces. You had to collect bones from hunting kills, break them down to access marrow and fat, and manage the burning process to extract maximum heat value. Water collection was another daily chore that required enormous effort, because water was often frozen solid and had to be melted using precious fuel that you needed for heating and cooking. You couldn't just turn on a tap or grab a bottle from the refrigerator. You had to find ice or snow, transport it back to your shelter, and convert it to liquid water through processes that consumed time, energy, and fuel. The water gathering process involved identifying clean ice or snow that wasn't contaminated with waste, debris, or other materials that could make you sick. You had to dig through snow layers to find clean water sources, break up ice formations that were often frozen too hard to work with easily, and transport heavy ice back to your shelter without losing pieces or exhausting yourself during the journey. Water processing required careful management of melting procedures that would convert ice to liquid without wasting fuel or creating more water than you could store or use immediately. The melting process had to be monitored constantly, because overheating would waste fuel, while underheating meant you wouldn't have enough liquid water for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene needs. Tool maintenance was a constant chore that required skills, materials, and time that had to be devoted to keeping your survival equipment functional. Every tool you used for hunting, gathering, food processing, and shelter maintenance required regular inspection, sharpening, repair, and replacement of components that wore out or broke under the stress of daily use. The tool-making process required expertise in working with stone, bone, wood, and other materials that had to be shaped, sharpened, and assembled into functional implements, using techniques that took years to master. You couldn't just buy replacement tools when yours broke. You had to create them from raw materials using skills that were essential for survival, but required constant practice to maintain. Trap checking was a daily chore that required traveling to locations where you'd set snares and other devices designed to catch small animals that could provide food and fur for your survival. But trap checking meant exposing yourself to dangerous conditions while traveling to locations that might be far from your shelter, and you had to do this regularly, regardless of weather or other circumstances. The trap maintenance process required expertise in animal behavior, trap construction, and positioning that would make modern hunters nervous. You had to understand how animals moved through the landscape, where they were likely to travel, and how to create traps that would be effective without being so obvious that animals would avoid them. Shelter maintenance was an ongoing chore that required constant attention to structural problems, insulation issues, and general deterioration that could compromise your protection from the elements. Your bone house or cave dwelling required regular inspection, repair, and improvement to maintain its effectiveness as a barrier between your family and an environment that was trying to kill you. The shelter repair process involved identifying problems before they became catastrophic, finding materials to fix structural issues, and performing construction work in conditions that made every aspect of the job more difficult. You had to maintain your shelter while living in it, which meant working around other people who were also trying to survive in the same cramped, uncomfortable space. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age chores so exhausting. You knew that every task you performed was essential for survival, but you also knew that completing your chores successfully was no guarantee that you'd have enough resources to survive the next day. You were running on a treadmill where falling behind meant death, but keeping up only meant you'd earned the right to do the same exhausting work again tomorrow. The time management aspect was absolutely brutal because you had to balance multiple life-threatening priorities while dealing with weather conditions, equipment failures, and physical limitations that made every task more difficult and time-consuming than it would be under normal circumstances. You couldn't just focus on one chore at a time. You had to coordinate multiple survival activities while maintaining the vigilance and energy necessary to avoid making mistakes that could kill you. Ice Age chores weren't about maintaining a comfortable lifestyle or keeping up with social expectations. They were about performing the physical work necessary to maintain the systems that kept you alive in an environment that was actively hostile to human existence. Every chore was a life or death responsibility that required expertise, physical effort, and constant attention to details that could determine whether you lived or died during the next 24-hour survival cycle. Now, we need to talk about Ice Age hunting. And I want you to forget everything you've seen in movies about heroic warriors charging at mammoths with spears. Ice Age hunting wasn't about bravery, adventure, or proving your manhood. It was about using every advantage you could possibly create to trick animals into situations where you could kill them before they killed you. And most hunting expeditions ended with exhausted, freezing humans trudging home empty-handed after days of exposure that nearly killed them. The fundamental reality of Ice Age hunting was that you were a relatively small, slow, weak primate, trying to kill animals that were bigger, faster, stronger, and better adapted to the environment than you were. Your only advantages were intelligence, tool use, and the ability to cooperate with other humans, advantages that were often negated by weather conditions, equipment failures, and the simple fact that animals had evolved to avoid becoming someone else's dinner. Hunting in Ice Age conditions meant tracking animals through snow, ice, and terrain that made every step dangerous while carrying weapons and equipment that were heavy, fragile, and often inadequate for the job you were trying to do. You had to move quietly enough to avoid alerting prey, quickly enough to keep up with animal movement, and carefully enough to avoid injuries that would make you unable to continue or return to your shelter. The tracking process required expertise that took years to develop and weather conditions that often made tracking impossible. You had to read animal signs in snow, understand how weather affected animal behavior, and predict where animals would go based on food availability, shelter needs, and seasonal patterns that were constantly changing due to Ice Age climate conditions. But here's where Ice Age hunting gets really brutal. You couldn't just chase animals until you caught them. Running in Ice Age conditions meant burning enormous amounts of calories that you didn't have while risking exhaustion, injury, or exposure that could kill you even if you successfully caught your prey. So hunting became a waiting game, where you positioned yourself in locations where animals might appear, and then endured hours or days of motionless exposure while hoping for opportunities that might never come. The waiting process was psychological and physical torture that required maintaining alertness and readiness to act while your body slowly lost heat to an environment that was actively trying to freeze you solid. You had to stay perfectly still for hours at a time, often in positions that were uncomfortable or painful, while dealing with cold that made your muscles stiff and your reactions slow. Camouflage and concealment required techniques that went far beyond modern hunting methods, because Ice Age animals were constantly alert for predators and had survival instincts that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. You had to blend into environments using materials that were available, eliminate human scents that would alert animals to your presence, and position yourself in ways that took advantage of wind, terrain, and animal behavior patterns. The concealment process involved covering yourself with animal skins, natural materials, and sometimes snow or mud that would help you blend into the environment while providing some protection from cold. But these concealment materials also made you more vulnerable to hypothermia and restricted your movement in ways that could prevent you from taking advantage of hunting opportunities when they finally appeared. Weapons systems were primitive by modern standards, but required enormous skill and expertise to use effectively. Spears, arrows, and other hunting tools had to be crafted from available materials, maintained in conditions that were hard on equipment, and used with precision that was difficult to achieve when you were cold, tired, and dealing with the physical stress of hunting in extreme conditions. The weapon-making process required selecting appropriate materials, shaping them into functional tools, and creating points that would penetrate animal hide and deliver lethal wounds. But Ice Age weapons were often fragile, unreliable, and required close-range approaches that put hunters in extreme danger from animals that could easily kill humans who got too close. Spear throwing required strength, accuracy, and timing that had to be maintained even when your muscles were cold and stiff from prolonged exposure. You typically only got one chance to make a killing throw, and missing meant that your prey would escape, and you'd wasted days of effort, energy, and resources that you couldn't afford to lose. The group coordination aspect was essential because most successful Ice Age hunts required multiple people working together to drive animals into killing positions, surround them to prevent escape, or coordinate attacks that would bring down large animals that individual hunters couldn't handle alone. But group hunting also meant that multiple people were exposed to danger, and that failure affected everyone who participated. Communication during hunts had to be silent, efficient, and perfectly coordinated, because mistakes in timing or positioning could result in lost opportunities, injured hunters, or animals that escaped after you'd invested enormous amounts of time and energy in the hunting process. Every hunter had to understand their role, execute it perfectly, and adapt to changing conditions without compromising the overall hunting strategy. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age hunting so terrifying. You knew that every hunting expedition was a life or death gamble, where success meant your family ate for the next few days, but failure meant watching them slowly starve while you tried to gather enough energy and resources for another hunting attempt that might also fail. The calorie calculation was absolutely brutal, because hunting required enormous energy expenditure that had to be recovered through successful kills. If you burned more calories hunting than you obtained from your prey, you were actually making your survival situation worse by wasting energy that you needed for other survival activities. Every hunt was an energy investment that had to pay off, or your family would be closer to starvation. Weather conditions determined whether hunting was possible at all, and Ice Age weather was often so severe that leaving your shelter meant probable death from exposure. You had to balance the need for food against the risk of losing hunters to weather conditions that could kill people faster than starvation would, and making the wrong choice could destroy your entire group's chances of survival. The injury risk was enormous because hunting put you in direct contact with large, dangerous animals that could kill you with a single kick, bite, or trampling attack. Injured hunters became burdens that the group couldn't afford to carry, and hunting injuries often meant slow, painful deaths from wounds that couldn't be properly treated with Ice Age medical knowledge and resources. Scavenging was often more productive than active hunting, because finding animals that had died from cold, disease, or other causes meant obtaining food without the energy expenditure and risk of actual hunting. But scavenging required competing with other predators and scavengers who were also desperate for food. And carrion often carried diseases that could kill people who were already weakened by survival stress. The scavenging process meant traveling extensively to find carcasses, fighting off other animals that were also trying to feed, and processing meat that was often partially decomposed or contaminated with bacteria that could cause serious illness. But scavenged meat was still valuable protein that could keep people alive when active hunting was impossible. Hunting success rates were probably much lower than modern people imagine, with most expeditions ending in failure despite enormous investments of time, energy, and risk. The animals that survived to the Ice Age were the ones that were best at avoiding predators, and humans were relatively new predators who were still learning how to hunt effectively in conditions that were hostile to human survival. Ice Age hunting wasn't about heroic adventures or proving your courage. It was about using every possible advantage to obtain protein that was essential for survival, while managing risks that could kill you faster than starvation would. You didn't hunt because you enjoyed it, or because it was exciting. You hunted because the alternative was watching your family die slowly from malnutrition, while you tried to find other food sources that probably didn't exist. Now we need to talk about what happened after a successful hunt, and I want you to prepare yourself for a reality that would make modern people immediately become vegetarians. Ice Age butchering wasn't about neat cuts of meat from a grocery store or civilized food preparation in a clean kitchen. It was about rapidly dismantling an entire animal carcass using stone tools while racing against time, weather, and scavengers to extract every possible calorie before the meat spoiled or froze into unusable chunks. The butchering process started immediately after the kill, because delays meant losing precious food to decomposition, predators, or freezing that would make processing more difficult. You couldn't just drag your kill back to camp and deal with it later. You had to begin field processing on the spot, often in conditions where wind snow and sub-zero temperatures made every aspect of the job brutally difficult, while your hands gradually lost feeling and functionality. Your tools for this job were sharp stones, bone knives, and whatever other cutting implements you could create from available materials. These weren't precision instruments designed for efficient meat processing. They were crude tools that required enormous amounts of skill and physical effort to use effectively. Every cut had to be made with tools that would dull quickly, break under stress, and require constant maintenance during the butchering process. The initial processing involved opening the animal's body cavity to access internal organs that had to be removed and processed immediately because they spoiled faster than muscle meat. This meant working with your hands inside a warm animal carcass while blood, fluids, and organ contents covered everything you were wearing and made your tools slippery and difficult to control. Organ meat was the first priority because it provided essential nutrients that weren't available from muscle meat, but organs had to be consumed fresh, or they would become dangerous to eat. The liver, heart, kidneys, and other organs were often eaten immediately while they were still warm from the animal's body heat, because waiting meant losing nutrition that could be critical for maintaining health during extended survival stress. The warm organ consumption process was probably revolting by modern standards, but it provided vitamins, minerals, and nutrients that prevented deficiency diseases, which could compromise your ability to survive Ice Age conditions. People who couldn't force themselves to eat fresh organs often developed health problems that made them more vulnerable to the infections and injuries that were constant threats. Blood collection was another immediate priority because blood was liquid protein that could be consumed fresh or processed into foods that would provide concentrated nutrition. But collecting blood required containers that could hold liquid without leaking, and the blood had to be processed quickly before it coagulated or froze into forms that were less useful for nutrition. The blood processing involved drinking fresh blood for immediate nutrition, mixing blood with other foods to create more substantial meals, or processing blood into foods that could be preserved for later consumption. But blood work had to be done quickly, because spilled blood would attract predators and scavengers who could steal your kill or attack your processing team. Fat extraction was critical, because fat provided more calories per unit weight than any other food source, but extracting fat required separating it from muscle tissue, organs, and other body parts through processes that were time-consuming and required specialized knowledge of animal anatomy. Every piece of fat that was wasted meant losing calories that could determine whether someone lived or died during the next food shortage. The fat processing procedure involved cutting away fat deposits, rendering fat into liquid form that could be stored more efficiently, and preserving fat through methods that would prevent spoilage while keeping it accessible for daily consumption. But fat processing required fuel for heating, containers for storage, and techniques that had to be performed correctly, or the fat would spoil and become dangerous to eat. Meat division required understanding animal anatomy, group social dynamics, and fair distribution systems that would prevent conflicts while ensuring that everyone received appropriate portions based on their contribution to the hunting effort and their current survival needs. The person who divided meat had enormous responsibility, because mistakes could cause social problems that would destroy group cooperation. The meat-sharing process wasn't about generosity or kindness. It was about survival mathematics that required calculating how much food each person needed, how much was available for distribution, and how to allocate resources in ways that would maximize the group's overall survival chances. Everyone understood that meat sharing was based on practical considerations rather than personal preferences or emotional relationships. Preservation methods had to be implemented immediately, because most of your meat would spoil quickly if it wasn't processed using techniques that would extend its usable life. This meant cutting meat into strips that could be dried, smoking meat using whatever fuel was available, or creating preservation systems that would keep meat edible for weeks or months. The meat drying process required cutting muscle tissue into specific thicknesses that would dry properly without spoiling, arranging meat in ways that would expose it to air circulation while protecting it from contamination, and managing the drying environment to achieve preservation without losing too much nutritional value. Drying conditions had to be carefully managed, because meat that dried too quickly would become tough and difficult to chew, while meat that dried too slowly would become mushy and unappetizing, slowly would spoil before preservation was complete. The weather conditions during drying determined whether preservation would be successful, and failed preservation meant losing food that could have sustained the group through periods when hunting was impossible. Smoking required creating fires that would produce smoke without too much heat, managing fuel supplies that were needed for other purposes, and maintaining smoking fires for extended periods while performing other survival activities. The smoking process could take days or weeks, during which the meat had to be protected from weather, scavengers, and other threats that could destroy your food supplies. Storage systems had to protect preserved meat from moisture, pests, scavengers, and environmental conditions that could cause spoilage or contamination. This meant creating storage containers from available materials, finding storage locations that would provide protection while remaining accessible, and managing stored food supplies to prevent waste while ensuring that preserved meat remained safe to eat. Hide processing was another immediate priority, because animal hides provided materials for clothing, shelter, tools, and other survival equipment that were essential for Ice Age survival. But hide processing required expertise, tools, and techniques that were time-consuming and physically demanding, while you were also trying to process meat and manage other aspects of the butchering operation. The hide preparation process involved removing flesh and fat from the skin, treating the hide to prevent decomposition, and beginning processing procedures that would eventually turn raw hide into usable materials. But hide work required immediate attention, because delays could result in losing materials that were essential for maintaining clothing and shelter systems. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age butchering so intense. You knew that every decision you made during the processing procedure could determine whether your family had enough food and materials to survive the next few weeks. Every cut, every preservation choice, and every resource allocation decision carried enormous consequences that could mean the difference between life and death. The time pressure was absolutely brutal, because you had to complete complex processing tasks while dealing with cold that made your hands numb and clumsy, tools that were difficult to use effectively, and the knowledge that predators and scavengers were probably watching your operation and waiting for opportunities to steal your food. Waste management during butchering meant that absolutely nothing from the animal could be discarded carelessly, because everything had potential survival value. Bones became tools and fuel, sinew became thread and rope, organs became food and medicine, and even contents from the animal's digestive system could be used for various survival purposes. Ice Age butchering wasn't about preparing meals or creating appetizing food. It was about rapidly converting an entire animal into resources that could keep your family alive while managing processing tasks that were physically demanding, technically complex, and absolutely essential for survival. You didn't butcher animals because you enjoyed the work. You butchered them because the alternative was watching your family slowly starve while looking at food that you couldn't properly process and preserve. Now we need to talk about the relentless, exhausting, never-ending battle to maintain body temperature during Ice Age winters. And I want you to understand that staying warm wasn't something you did between other activities. Staying warm was your full-time job that required constant attention, continuous effort, and the kind of obsessive vigilance that most modern people reserve for keeping premature babies alive in hospital incubators. Ice Age warmth management was like running a personal heating system that could fail catastrophically at any moment, using fuel sources that were constantly running out, equipment that broke regularly, and techniques that required expertise you had to maintain even when you were exhausted, sick, or dealing with other survival emergencies. You didn't just get warm and stay warm. You chased warmth like it was a living thing that was constantly trying to escape from your body. The heated stone system was one of the most effective warming techniques, but it required enormous amounts of planning, fuel, and physical effort to maintain. You had to find stones that would retain heat without cracking when exposed to fire, heat them using precious fuel that you needed for other purposes, and transport red-hot rocks using tools and techniques that could easily result in serious burns or accidents. The stone heating process involved selecting rocks that were the right size and composition for heat retention, positioning them in fires for extended periods to absorb maximum heat, and then moving them using improvised tools while they were hot enough to instantly burn anything they touched. You had to handle rocks that could cause third-degree burns while working with tools that were crude, unreliable, and often inadequate for safely managing objects that were literally glowing with heat. Stone placement required understanding how radiant heat worked, where to position hot rocks for maximum warming effect, and how to create barriers that would prevent accidental contact while still allowing heat transfer. You had to arrange stones in ways that would provide warmth without creating fire hazards, and you had to do this while the stones were cooling and losing their heating effectiveness. The stone cooling process meant that your heat source was constantly diminishing, so you had to plan replacement cycles that would maintain continuous warmth while managing fuel consumption and the physical effort required to keep heating new stones. It was like running a heating system where you had to manually replace the heat source every few hours, using processes that were dangerous, exhausting, and required constant attention. Body huddling was another essential warming technique that required surrendering personal space and privacy to share body heat with other people who were equally desperate to stay warm. This wasn't casual snuggling or comfortable companionship. It was pressing your body against other unwashed, possibly sick humans, while trying to arrange yourselves in ways that would maximize heat sharing while minimizing discomfort. The huddling arrangement process required understanding group dynamics, body heat distribution, and positioning strategies that would provide maximum warmth for the greatest number of people. You had to coordinate with others to create human heating systems that were effective while being sustainable over extended periods of time. Group sleeping arrangements meant that your most vulnerable time, when you were unconscious and couldn't actively manage your body temperature, became a collective survival challenge that required trusting other people to maintain the heating systems that kept everyone alive. You fell asleep pressed against other people, sharing heat and hoping that nobody would move in ways that would expose others to deadly cold. Windshielding required constant awareness of air movement and positioning yourself in ways that would minimize heat loss to wind, that could strip warmth from your body faster than you could generate it. This meant understanding how wind moved through your environment, where to find natural windbreaks, and how to create barriers using whatever materials were available. The windbreak construction process involved identifying materials that would block air movement, arranging them in ways that would provide protection while remaining stable in wind conditions, and maintaining these barriers against wind damage that could destroy hours of construction work in minutes. Every windbreak was a temporary solution that required constant maintenance and improvement. Personal wind management meant positioning your body, clothing, and equipment in ways that would minimize exposure to air movement while still allowing you to perform necessary survival activities. You had to work, hunt, and move, while constantly managing your orientation to wind that could cause rapid heat loss if you weren't careful about how you positioned yourself. Shelter heating involved creating warm microclimates inside your bonehouse or cave, using techniques that required balancing heat production with ventilation needs, fuel consumption, and fire safety. You had to maintain fires that would provide warmth without suffocating everyone with smoke or consuming all your fuel in a single day. The interior heating process required understanding how warm air moved inside enclosed spaces, where to position heat sources for maximum effectiveness, and how to manage heat distribution so that everyone in your shelter received adequate warmth. This meant creating heating systems that were effective while being safe enough to operate in cramped quarters filled with flammable materials. Heat conservation techniques required understanding how your body lost heat and implementing strategies that would minimize heat loss while still allowing you to function normally. This meant managing your clothing systems, controlling your physical activity levels, and making behavioral choices that would maintain your core temperature without wasting energy on heat production that exceeded what you could sustain. The activity management process involved planning your daily tasks in ways that would generate body heat through physical activity while avoiding overexertion that could lead to sweating, which would create moisture that could freeze and make you colder than before you started moving. You had to balance activity and rest in ways that would maintain warmth without wasting energy. Exercise for warmth required understanding how different types of physical activity generated heat, which exercises were most effective for warming specific body parts, and how to manage exercise intensity to produce heat without creating exhaustion or moisture problems that could make you more vulnerable to cold injury. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age warmth management so exhausting. You knew that every moment of warmth you achieved was temporary, and that maintaining your body temperature required constant effort that never ended, never got easier, and could never be taken for granted even for a few minutes. The heat source competition meant that everyone in your group was competing for access to limited warming resources, and maintaining your own warmth often meant making choices that affected other people's ability to stay warm. Every heated stone, every position near the fire, and every opportunity for body heat sharing had to be negotiated and managed through social systems that balanced individual survival needs with group cooperation. Heat loss monitoring required constant attention to how your body was losing heat and immediate responses to prevent heat loss from reaching levels that could cause hypothermia or frostbite. You had to continuously assess your warmth status, identify heat loss problems before they became dangerous, and implement warming strategies before your body temperature dropped to critically low levels. The warming technique rotation meant that you had to constantly switch between different methods of heat generation and conservation, because no single technique was adequate for maintaining warmth throughout an entire day. You used heated stones until they cooled, then switched to physical activity until you became exhausted, then moved to group huddling until social dynamics required changes, then back to stone heating or whatever other techniques were available. Ice Age warmth management wasn't about being comfortable or cozy. It was about maintaining the minimum body temperature necessary for survival while managing heat resources that were limited, techniques that were exhausting, and warming systems that required constant attention and expertise. You didn't stay warm because it felt good. You stayed warm because the alternative was freezing to death while surrounded by people who were also fighting the same desperate battle against an environment that was actively trying to kill everyone through gradual heat extraction. You spent every waking moment of every day chasing warmth that was constantly escaping from your body, and the chase never ended because stopping meant dying from cold. That was patient, persistent, and absolutely determined to win. Now we need to talk about getting sick or injured during the Ice Age. And I want you to understand that a simple cold, a minor cut, or a twisted ankle wasn't just an inconvenience that would slow you down for a few days. Ice Age illness and injury were essentially death sentences that played out in slow motion, because there were no doctors, no medications, no hospitals, and no safety nets to catch you when your body started failing in an environment that was already trying to kill you. The medical reality of Ice Age survival was that your body had to function perfectly under extreme stress, or you became a burden that your group couldn't afford to carry. There was no sick leave, no medical insurance, and no rehabilitation programs for people who couldn't contribute to the life or death activities that kept everyone alive. If you couldn't hunt, gather, maintain fires, or perform other essential survival tasks, you were essentially dead weight that was consuming resources without providing value. A cough wasn't just annoying, it was a potential death sentence that could indicate respiratory infections, pneumonia, or other lung problems that would make you unable to perform the physical activities required for survival. In Ice Age conditions, respiratory problems meant you couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't gather fuel in cold conditions, and couldn't maintain the activity levels necessary for staying warm and functional. The cough situation was made worse by the fact that everyone was living in close quarters, breathing the same recycled air and sharing whatever pathogens were circulating through the group. When someone started coughing, everyone knew that the illness would probably spread to other group members, potentially incapacitating multiple people at the same time when everyone's contribution was essential for group survival. Listening to someone cough became a group survival assessment where everyone was evaluating whether the sick person was developing something that could kill them, something that could spread to others, or something that would make them unable to contribute to group activities. Every cough was a potential indicator that your survival group was about to lose a member through illness that you couldn't treat or prevent. The silence that followed coughing fits wasn't just awkward social behavior. It was the sound of people calculating survival odds, assessing their own health status, and mentally preparing for the possibility that illness might reduce the group's effectiveness, enough to threaten everyone's survival. Nobody talked about illness directly, because everyone understood the implications without discussion. Injury management was even more brutal, because Ice Age conditions meant that minor injuries could easily become life-threatening problems if they weren't treated properly. A small cut could become infected, leading to blood poisoning that would kill you. A sprained ankle could prevent you from hunting or gathering, making you unable to contribute to group survival while still consuming precious resources. The infection risk was enormous, because everything in your environment was contaminated with bacteria, animal waste, decomposing organic matter, and other sources of pathogens that could cause serious infections in wounds that couldn't be properly cleaned or treated. Every injury was a potential entry point for bacteria that could cause infections that would kill you slowly and painfully. Wound cleaning involved using whatever water was available, which was often contaminated, limited in quantity, and had to be heated using precious fuel that was needed for other survival purposes. You couldn't just run water over injuries or use antiseptic solutions. You had to clean wounds using materials that were often inadequate for preventing infection. The cleaning process required removing debris, foreign objects, and contaminated tissue from injuries using tools that were crude, painful to use, and often caused additional tissue damage. Every wound cleaning procedure was performed without anesthesia, pain medication, or proper surgical instruments, making the treatment process almost as traumatic as the original injury. Bandaging and wound protection meant using whatever materials were available to cover injuries and prevent additional contamination. This usually involved animal hide, fur, plant materials, or other organic matter that had to be secured to wounds using improvised fastening methods that were often inadequate for providing proper protection. The bandaging materials were often contaminated themselves, so covering wounds sometimes introduced new sources of infection while trying to protect injuries from environmental contamination. Every bandage was a compromise between protecting wounds and potentially making infection problems worse through the use of non-sterile materials. Bone fractures were essentially death sentences because broken bones required immobilization, extended recovery periods, and medical care that wasn't available during Ice Age survival. A broken leg meant you couldn't hunt, gather, or perform other essential activities, making you a burden that consumed resources while providing no survival value to the group. The fracture treatment process involved trying to set bones using crude techniques, improvised splinting materials, and pain management methods that were inadequate for dealing with the trauma of bone injuries. Most broken bones probably healed poorly or not at all, leaving people with permanent disabilities that made them unable to contribute to survival activities. Immobilization for fracture healing meant that someone had to be cared for by other group members who were already struggling to meet their own survival needs. The resources required for caring for seriously injured people often exceeded what groups could afford to provide while still maintaining their own survival systems. Dental problems were another source of serious health issues, because tooth decay, gum disease, and dental infections could cause pain that made eating difficult, infections that could spread to other parts of the body, and health problems that would compromise someone's ability to function during survival activities. The dental pain management process involved using whatever materials were available to reduce discomfort, but effective pain relief was usually impossible to achieve. Dental problems often became chronic sources of pain and infection that gradually weakened people and made them less able to contribute to group survival efforts. Tooth extraction was sometimes necessary for serious dental problems, but the extraction process involved using crude tools, no anesthesia, and techniques that were extremely painful and often caused additional injuries. Many people probably suffered with serious dental problems rather than undergo extraction procedures that were almost as traumatic as the original problems. Fever management was critical because elevated body temperature during Ice Age conditions meant that sick people were losing heat they couldn't afford to lose, while also requiring additional resources for care that healthy people needed for their own survival. Fever was often a sign of serious illness that could kill people or make them unable to contribute to group activities. The fever treatment process involved trying to manage body temperature using whatever cooling or warming methods were available. But these treatments often required resources that were needed for other survival purposes. Caring for feverish people meant diverting attention and resources from activities that were essential for everyone's survival. Dehydration during illness was particularly dangerous because water was often limited, difficult to obtain, and required fuel to convert from ice to liquid form. Sick people who needed additional water consumption were competing with healthy people for water resources that were already inadequate for basic survival needs. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age illness and injury so terrifying. Everyone understood that getting sick or injured was essentially a death sentence that would play out over days or weeks, while you gradually became unable to contribute to the activities that kept everyone alive. Every symptom, every pain, and every sign of illness was a potential indicator that your survival time was running out. The isolation aspect was particularly brutal because sick people often had to be separated from healthy group members to prevent disease transmission. But isolation meant losing access to shared body heat, group protection, and social support that were essential for survival. Being sick meant being alone when you most needed help. The resource allocation decisions were heartbreaking because caring for sick people required resources that healthy people needed for their own survival. Every decision about whether to provide care, how much care to provide, and when to stop providing care was essentially a decision about who would live and who would die. Ice Age illness and injury management wasn't about healthcare or medical treatment. It was about making brutal decisions about resource allocation while watching people suffer from conditions that might be treatable with modern medicine, but were essentially death sentences in an environment where survival required perfect health and maximum physical capability from everyone in the group. You didn't get sick or injured during the Ice Age. You began the process of dying while hoping that you'd recover quickly enough to resume contributing to survival activities. Before your group decided that caring for you was consuming resources they couldn't afford to waste on someone who might not recover. Now let's talk about the evening meal, which wasn't about family bonding, favorite recipes, or winding down after a long day. Ice Age dinner was about consuming whatever food was available while it was still warm, hoping there would be enough to prevent anyone from going to bed hungry, and trying to extract maximum nutrition from scraps and leftovers that modern people would throw away without thinking twice. Dinner preparation began with assessing what food was actually available after a day of hunting, gathering, and rationing supplies that were constantly running low. You couldn't just decide what you wanted to eat and then prepare it. You had to work with whatever had been successfully obtained, processed, and preserved since the last meal, which might be very little or nothing at all. The cooking process required using precious fuel to heat whatever food was available, which meant balancing the need for warm meals against the need to conserve fuel for heating, fire maintenance, and other survival priorities. Every piece of wood, dung, or other combustible material that you used for cooking was fuel that couldn't be used for staying warm during the night. Hot broth was the foundation of most Ice Age dinners because it provided warm calories that could help maintain body temperature while delivering nutrition from bones, scraps, and whatever organic matter could be boiled into something edible. The broth was made from whatever was available: bones, fat, organ scraps, and plant materials that had been scavenged during the day. The broth preparation process involved boiling water using containers that were often crude, unreliable, and inadequate for efficient cooking. You had to manage cooking fires that produced smoke in enclosed spaces, monitor food that could easily burn or spoil, and create meals that would provide maximum nutrition while using minimum fuel. Meat scraps were added to evening meals when they were available, but these were usually the less desirable portions that hadn't been consumed earlier in the day or preserved for future use. Dinner meat was often gristle, organ pieces, or small amounts of muscle tissue that had been saved from hunting kills or scavenging activities. The meat preparation involved cutting scraps into sizes that would cook quickly and efficiently, removing spoiled portions that could cause illness, and stretching small amounts of protein to feed everyone in the group. Every piece of meat was precious, and waste wasn't just inefficient, it was potentially life-threatening for people who were already struggling to maintain adequate nutrition. Rationing was a constant concern, because dinner portions had to be calculated based on how much food was available, how many people needed to be fed, and what resources might be available for future meals. Nobody ate as much as they wanted. Everyone ate as much as the group could afford to provide while still maintaining food supplies for tomorrow. The eating process was communal and carefully managed, because food sharing was essential for group survival and social cohesion. Everyone ate together. Portions were distributed according to established protocols, and meals were consumed quickly while the food was still warm and before conditions made eating more difficult. Here's the reality that makes Ice Age dinner so sobering. Even a successful evening meal that provided adequate nutrition was no guarantee that food would be available tomorrow. Every dinner could potentially be the last substantial meal for several days, and everyone ate with the understanding that tomorrow's food supply depended on survival activities that might fail completely. Ice Age dinner wasn't a social event or a culinary experience. It was the daily process of consuming whatever calories were available, while hoping that tomorrow would provide enough food to justify the energy expenditure required to stay alive in an environment that was actively trying to kill everyone through starvation and exposure. Now let's talk about sleep during the Ice Age, which wasn't about getting comfortable, having sweet dreams, or waking up refreshed for another day. Ice Age sleep was about losing consciousness for a few hours, while hoping that someone else would keep the fire burning, that predators wouldn't attack your shelter, and that you'd wake up with all your extremities still attached and functioning. The shift system meant that someone always had to be awake, monitoring the fire. That was the only thing keeping everyone from freezing to death during the coldest part of the day. Fire duty during sleep shifts wasn't just staying awake. It was maintaining perfect vigilance while exhausted, cold, and dealing with the psychological pressure of knowing that falling asleep on your watch could kill everyone you cared about. The fire watch process required understanding how to maintain fires during the night without wasting fuel, how to add combustible materials without creating dangerous flare-ups, and how to manage smoke and ventilation in enclosed spaces where carbon monoxide could kill sleeping people. Every fire tender carried the responsibility of keeping everyone alive while they were unconscious and vulnerable. Rotating sleep schedules meant that everyone had to take turns staying awake during the most dangerous part of the day, when temperatures were lowest, predators were most active, and weather conditions were often at their worst. Your sleep time was determined by fire duty schedules, not by when you felt tired or when you wanted to rest. The sleeping arrangement process involved creating shared body heat systems, where multiple people pressed together to share warmth while sleeping on surfaces that were cold, uncomfortable, and often damp from condensation and accumulated moisture. Privacy was impossible, and personal space was a luxury that could get everyone killed. Group sleeping positions had to be coordinated to maximize warmth sharing, while allowing people to move for fire duty without disturbing others. Everyone slept pressed against other unwashed, possibly sick people, while wearing the same fur clothes they'd been wearing all day, creating conditions that were claustrophobic, unsanitary, and psychologically exhausting. The covering system used whatever materials were available to create insulation layers over sleeping people. Animal hides, furs, and sometimes snow that would provide additional insulation while creating barriers against wind that could strip heat from sleeping bodies. Every covering had to be arranged carefully to provide maximum warmth without creating suffocation hazards. Temperature management during sleep required understanding how your body lost heat while unconscious and implementing strategies to maintain core temperature without the active heat generation that was possible during waking hours. Sleeping people were particularly vulnerable to hypothermia because they couldn't respond to temperature changes or adjust their warming systems. The wake-up process involved checking your extremities for signs of frostbite, assessing your overall health status after hours of exposure to cold, and determining whether you'd maintained adequate body temperature during sleep. Every morning began with the possibility that you'd discover frost damage that had occurred while you were unconscious. Here's the psychological reality that makes Ice Age sleep so terrifying. You fell asleep every night, knowing that sleep made you vulnerable to threats you couldn't control, that your survival depended on other people maintaining systems that could fail, and that waking up was never guaranteed in an environment where small mistakes during the night could kill everyone. Ice Age sleep wasn't rest. It was a daily gamble with unconsciousness, where the stakes were life or death, and losing the gamble meant never waking up to face another day of brutal survival in a world that was actively trying to freeze you to death. So there you have it, a single day during the Ice Age, from crawling out of your bone house to falling asleep while hoping your toes would still be pink in the morning. And I want you to understand that everything we've just walked through wasn't an exceptionally bad day or an extreme survival scenario. This was just Tuesday. This was normal life for thousands of years, for millions of people who somehow managed to survive long enough to eventually become your ancestors. The truly disturbing part about Ice Age survival isn't that it was difficult, it's that it was so relentlessly, exhaustingly difficult that every single aspect of human existence was reduced to basic survival mathematics. There were no hobbies, no personal interests, no career ambitions, just the constant, never-ending work of staying alive for another 24-hour cycle. Your Ice Age ancestors didn't have bad days and good days. They had days when everyone survived and days when someone died. They didn't have weekends or vacations. They had seasons when survival was barely possible and seasons when survival was absolutely impossible. Every morning, your ancestors woke up facing the same question: what do we need to do today to not die? And every evening, they went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would bring the same desperate struggle against an environment that was actively trying to kill them through cold, starvation, injury, illness, and exposure. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. They didn't just survive. They survived well enough to reproduce, raise children, and maintain the cultural knowledge that eventually led to the comfortable modern world that allows us to discuss their struggles while sitting in heated rooms. So the next time you think your life is difficult, remember that you're descended from people who lived in houses made of mammoth bones, wore unwashed fur clothes for months, and considered frozen marrow a feast. Your ancestors survived conditions that would kill most modern people in hours, and they did it for thousands of years. The Ice Age was humanity's ultimate survival test, and the fact that you're here means your ancestors passed through sheer determination and daily courage that modern people can barely imagine.